The hushed anticipation in the courtroom was a palpable weight, pressing down on every soul present. This wasn't a sensational murder trial with grotesque details. It was something far more insidious, a betrayal that struck at the very heart of trust and innocence. It involved Eleanor Vance, a beloved high school English teacher, a woman whose dazzling smile and articulate wisdom had charmed countless parents and inspired hundreds of students. But across the aisle, barely able to meet the gaze of the jury, sat Ethan Miller, her former student. A gifted artist, now a fractured young man, whose fragile testimony threatened to tear down the revered image of Ms. Vance and expose a secret so dark it would send shockwaves far beyond the quiet hallways of Northwood High. The case, Commonwealth versus Vance, had begun quietly, almost dismissed as a misunderstanding. A civil complaint initially, seeking damages for emotional distress, it quickly escalated when Ethan's therapist, Dr. Evelyn Reed, presented findings that suggested a pattern of psychological manipulation and coercion, pushing the district attorney's office to reconsider. What had seemed like a curious, perhaps inappropriate, bond between a mentor and a mentee now loomed as a potential criminal offense, a breach of trust, an abuse of power, cloaked in the guise of intellectual camaraderie. From the moment the charges were announced, the community was bifurcated. Half rallied around Eleanor Vance, fiercely defending her impeccable character. The other half, horrified by the whispers, demanded justice for Ethan. The media, initially cautious, soon descended like vultures, recognizing the potent cocktail of forbidden romance, shattered innocence, and the public's insatiable appetite for the downfall of an idol. But behind the headlines, a deeper, more chilling narrative was slowly beginning to unfold within the cold, sterile walls of the courtroom. Judge Evelyn Hayes, a woman known for her sharp intellect and an almost unnerving ability to cut through legal theatrics, watched the proceedings with a gaze that betrayed nothing. She had seen countless dramas unfold in her court, but this one carried a particular kind of quiet dread. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Sarah Jenkins, a meticulous and empathetic lawyer, knew her case hinged not on physical evidence, which was scarce, but on the delicate, often contradictory recollections of a traumatized teenager and the expert analysis that could give those memories context and credibility. Defense attorney Marcus Thorne, a man whose reputation for tearing down witness credibility was legendary, stood tall, radiating confidence. He had a clear strategy: paint Ethan Miller as an unstable, perhaps obsessive, young man, prone to exaggeration, who had misinterpreted a caring mentor's guidance as something darker. He would highlight every inconsistency, every moment of doubt, turning the victim into the villain in the eyes of the jury. The first few days were a blur of procedural motions and the selection of a jury, a cross-section of the community, all of whom carried their own biases and preconceived notions about teachers, students, and the insidious nature of hidden relationships. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with the weight of reputation against the fragility of truth. The world outside, glued to their screens, speculated wildly. Was Eleanor Vance a predatory monster hiding in plain sight, or was she an innocent woman caught in a malicious lie? As ADA Jenkins delivered her opening statement, her voice was calm, almost understated, a deliberate contrast to the gravity of her words. She spoke of the profound trust placed in educators, the vulnerability of young minds, and how that trust could be systematically eroded, replaced by a twisted dependency. She didn't sensationalize. She simply laid out the devastating narrative of a student allegedly groomed, isolated, and psychologically controlled. The jury watched, their faces a mixture of skepticism and dawning unease. But it was Marcus Thorne's opening that truly set the stage for the battle to come. He painted Eleanor Vance as a paragon of virtue, a dedicated educator targeted by a disturbed young man. He spoke of misguided affection, misinterpretation, and false accusations born of fantasy and resentment. He didn't just defend. He attacked, subtly planting seeds of doubt about Ethan's character and motives. A ripple of whispers ran through the public gallery. Judge Hayes, with a stern look, quickly quelled it, but the seed was planted. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Ethan Miller was called to the stand. His entrance was hesitant, his shoulders hunched, eyes avoiding the jury, the judge, and most painfully, the defendant's table where Eleanor Vance sat, serene and composed, her gaze unwavering. Ada Jenkins approached him gently, her voice soft, guiding him through the initial pleasantries, trying to make him comfortable. But the tension in the room was suffocating. Every breath seemed audible. Ethan began to speak, his voice barely a whisper, recounting his struggles with anxiety, his passion for art, and how Miss Vance had initially seemed like a beacon of understanding. He spoke of late-night emails about literature, then personal struggles, then shared vulnerabilities. The narrative was slow, fragmented, punctuated by long pauses and moments where his voice cracked, threatening to give way entirely. The jury leaned forward, trying to piece together the mosaic of his experience. He described the special projects after school, the mentorship sessions that extended late into the evening, the emotional intimacy that blurred lines. He spoke of her compliments, her unique understanding of his soul, how she made him feel seen in a way no one else had. It sounded, initially, like the ideal teacher-student bond. But then, almost imperceptibly, his words began to shift, revealing the subtle creep of something more. The conversations became increasingly personal, isolating him from his friends, making him feel that only Ms. Vance truly understood him. The silence in the courtroom became absolute as Ethan recounted the first physical touch, a hand on his arm that lingered too long, a comforting hug that felt less like comfort and more like a claim. His voice trembled, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the courtroom walls, reliving the moments that had irrevocably altered his life. He described a calculated affection, a slow, methodical chipping away at his boundaries, disguised as profound empathy. He confessed to feeling confused, flattered, and increasingly dependent on her approval. Ada Jenkins handled him with kid gloves, knowing how fragile he was. She walked him through the timeline, connecting the dots of late-night texts, secluded meetings, and the gradual erosion of his autonomy. She presented screenshots of messages, subtly suggestive, laden with emotional weight, where Ms. Vance's words, seemingly innocuous to an outsider, held deep, manipulative power for Ethan. The language was coded, full of inside jokes and shared secrets, designed to create a world where only they existed. Yet, despite the emotional weight, Ethan's testimony, by its very nature, contained inconsistencies. Details blurred, timelines shifted slightly under the pressure of recall. He struggled with exact dates, with specific phrases. Thorne, during his cross-examination, pounced on these. He tore into Ethan's memory, questioning his motives, suggesting fabrication, implying a jilted infatuation. "Mr. Miller," Thorne's voice boomed, sharp and accusatory, "you claim Ms. Vance isolated you. Yet you admit to attending school dances, participating in club activities. You had friends, didn't you?" Ethan stammered, "Yes, but she made me feel like they didn't really understand me. Like only she truly did." Thorne scoffed. "So, you chose to spend time with her, Mr. Miller. You chose to confide in her. No one forced you to respond to her texts, did they?" He pressed hard, dissecting every moment, every decision, twisting Ethan's emotional dependency into willing participation. The young man visibly shrunk on the stand, his resolve faltering. His voice grew weaker, his answers more hesitant. At one point, Thorne leaned in, his voice dripping with insinuation. "Isn't it true, Mr. Miller, that you harbored a secret crush on Ms. Vance? A crush that, when unreciprocated, led you down a path of resentment and, ultimately, fabrication?" The accusation hung heavy in the air, a punch to Ethan's already bruised psyche. He looked lost, his eyes darting around the room, finally landing on Eleanor Vance, who offered a small, sympathetic shake of her head, as if pitying his delusion. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare by Thorne. Ethan's face crumpled, and he burst into tears, Unable to continue, Judge Hayes, seeing his distress, called for a recess. The court reconvened and Ethan, though visibly shaken, returned. But the damage was done. The jury had seen his emotional instability. Doubts, once subtle, now gnawed at the edges of their minds. Had this young man, perhaps, romanticized an innocent relationship? Was he, as Thorne suggested, simply lashing out after a perceived rejection? Ada Jenkins knew she had to rebuild. Her next witness was Dr. Evelyn Reed, the clinical psychologist who had treated Ethan. Dr. Reed, composed and articulate, spoke of the dynamics of grooming, of the subtle, insidious ways a predator can manipulate a vulnerable mind. She explained the concept of trauma bonding, where a victim develops an unhealthy attachment to their abuser, mistaking control for affection. She detailed how memory can be fragmented, how fear and shame can lead to inconsistencies in recall, not as a sign of fabrication, but as a symptom of deep psychological distress. Mr. Miller's testimony, while perhaps imperfect in its chronological details, Dr. Reed asserted, her gaze steady, is entirely consistent with the psychological profile of a young person subjected to prolonged emotional and psychological manipulation by an authority figure. Thorne, during his cross-examination of Dr. Reed, was aggressive but less successful. He tried to discredit her expertise, suggesting she was biased by her therapeutic relationship with Ethan. But Dr. Reed held her ground, citing extensive research and case studies. She calmly explained the signs: the increasing isolation, the blurring of professional boundaries, the emotional dependence fostered by the abuser, the gaslighting that made the victim doubt their own perceptions. She meticulously dissected the teacher's alleged tactics, explaining how a seemingly innocent compliment could be a tool of control, how shared vulnerability could be exploited. The jury listened intently. Dr. Reed's clinical analysis provided a framework, a lens through which to re-examine Ethan's raw, emotional testimony. The fragmented memories now seemed less like inconsistencies and more like pieces of a deeply disturbing puzzle. The courtroom atmosphere shifted. The defense's initial confident air began to fray. Ada Jenkins then called a former student of Ms. Vance, Chloe Davies. Chloe, now in her early 20s, testified hesitantly about a similar pattern of special attention she had received from Ms. Vance years prior. Late-night discussions, private meetings, emotional dependency. She described feeling like Ms. Vance was her soulmate at the time, but looking back, the relationship felt unsettling. She admitted nothing explicitly criminal had occurred with her, but the emotional manipulation she felt now, in retrospect, mirrored Ethan's account chillingly. She knew all my insecurities, Chloe testified, her voice thick with residual hurt. She used them to make me feel special, like only she could truly guide me. It felt good then, like I was chosen. But now, it just feels invasive, like she was digging around in my head. Thorne aggressively cross-examined Chloe, trying to paint her as a disgruntled former student, perhaps seeking attention or influenced by Ethan's current accusations. He highlighted the absence of any criminal charges in her case, implying her testimony was merely speculative. But Chloe's quiet dignity and the unsettling parallels in her story began to resonate with some jurors. Judge Hayes observed the shift in the jury's body language, the increasing discomfort, the furrowed brows. The prosecution also presented digital evidence. Not explicit, but a trove of emails and messages between Ms. Vance and Ethan. Ada Jenkins projected them onto the large screens in the courtroom. While individual messages seemed benign, taken collectively, they painted a picture of a relationship that had slowly, insidiously, crossed every professional boundary. Texts exchanged at 2 a.m., emails filled with emotionally charged language, discussions about Ethan's private life that went far beyond a teacher's remit. "You see, ladies and gentlemen," Ada Jenkins explained, her voice grave, "each of these interactions in isolation might seem harmless. A caring teacher, a struggling student. But when you string them together over months, years, a pattern emerges. A pattern of calculated emotional grooming." of dependency fostered, of boundaries systematically dismantled. It's a slow strangulation of the soul, not a sudden blow. The defense tried to explain away the communications as merely deeply empathetic teaching, proof of Ms. Vance's dedication. They argued the tone was misinterpreted, the context skewed. But the sheer volume and intensely personal nature of the exchanges, spanning hundreds of pages, began to erode the jury's tolerance for such explanations. Then came the moment of profound silence. Ada Jenkins brought forward a photograph, a seemingly innocuous snapshot from a school event, taken months before the allegations surfaced. It showed Ms. Vance, radiant, arm around Ethan, who looked uncharacteristically withdrawn. A small detail, easily missed. But the prosecutor drew the jury's attention to Ms. Vance's hand, subtly resting on Ethan's lower back, just at the edge of what felt appropriate for a teacher. "Look closely, ladies and gentlemen," Jenkins urged, her voice low. "Look at the posture, the subtle possessiveness, the way Ms. Vance leans in, while Ethan leans away, his body language speaking volumes of his discomfort, even then. This isn't just a teacher and a student. This is a predator marking her territory, unknowingly captured by a casual camera." The image lingered on the screen. The jury murmured, a collective gasp echoing softly through the room. Judge Hayes, initially maintaining her stoic composure, leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied the photograph. Eleanor Vance, usually so composed, shifted uneasily in her seat, a flicker of something akin to panic crossing her face for the briefest moment. The atmosphere in the courtroom had become charged. The initial narrative of an innocent teacher being maligned was now being systematically dismantled. The subtle psychological cues, the patterns of manipulation, the slow erosion of boundaries, it all painted a terrifyingly consistent picture. The public gallery, initially divided, now largely swayed by the prosecution's methodical deconstruction, whispered in outrage. Ada Jenkins then introduced an expert on digital forensics who testified about deleted messages recovered from Ms. Vance's phone, not direct confessions, but exchanges with a friend, expressing frustration about Ethan becoming clingy and the lines getting blurry. The defense argued these were taken out of context, normal venting. But the prosecution highlighted the timing of these deleted messages, coinciding with periods of heightened emotional distress reported by Ethan. It suggested a conscious effort to conceal, a guilt she herself was grappling with, even if subconsciously. The defense, increasingly desperate, put Eleanor Vance on the stand. She was a master of self-presentation. Her voice was clear, calm, regretful. She spoke of her passion for teaching, her genuine care for all her students, especially those struggling like Ethan. She admitted to forming a close bond, but characterized it as purely academic and mentorship-driven, perhaps naive in its intensity. She cried, tears streaming down her face, as she spoke of the devastation these accusations had brought upon her life, her career, her reputation. She described Ethan as a troubled young man she had tried to help, but who had, sadly, developed an unhealthy obsession. "I loved teaching Ethan," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "I cared for him deeply, as I do for all my students. I saw his potential, his pain. I wanted to guide him. I never, not once, intended any harm. This has been a horrific misunderstanding. A cruel twist of fate for trying to be a compassionate educator." Her testimony was compelling, almost heartbreaking. Some jurors visibly empathized. It was a powerful performance, a masterful display of denial mixed with just enough vulnerability to seem credible. Thorne watched, a slight, knowing smile playing on his lips. He had brought her back from the brink. But Ada Jenkins, during her cross-examination, was relentless. She didn't attack directly. Instead, she methodically dismantled Eleanor Vance's carefully constructed narrative, piece by agonizing piece. She returned to the digital communications, asking specific questions about the timing, the coded language. "Ms. Vance," Jenkins began, her voice steady, "you claim your relationship with Ethan was purely professional. Yet, here, in a message sent at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, you tell him, quote, "You're the only one who truly understands my artistic soul." Is that standard professional communication, Ms. Vance? Eleanor Vance hesitated, her composure wavering for the first time. It was an expression of shared passion. We connected on an intellectual level. Jenkins pressed on. And the numerous gifts, Ms. Vance? The expensive art supplies, the concert tickets? Were those also part of your professional mentorship program? Ms. Vance squirmed. I sometimes gave students small tokens of encouragement. Ethan was a gifted artist. I wanted to support his talent. Her voice was losing its steady quality, a hint of defensiveness creeping in. Small tokens, Ms. Vance? Jenkins countered, holding up a receipt for a high-end graphics tablet. This cost over $700 for a student whose family struggled financially. Don't you think that creates a profound sense of obligation, of dependency, far beyond that of a normal teacher-student relationship? Eleanor Vance's carefully constructed facade began to crack. Her denial, once firm, now seemed brittle. She started to fidget, her eyes darting to her lawyer, then to the jury, who watched her with a newly critical gaze. The silence in the room was electric, charged with the weight of unspoken truths. Jenkins then introduced testimony from school administrators regarding Ms. Vance's repeated failures to properly document her mentorship sessions with Ethan, a clear violation of school policy designed to protect both students and staff. You knew the rules, Ms. Vance, didn't you? Jenkins asked, her voice quiet but piercing. You knew that private, unsupervised meetings with a student, particularly after hours, required documentation and parental notification. Yet time and again, you failed to do so. Why, Ms. Vance? Were you simply forgetful, or was there something you wished to conceal? The question hung in the air, a poison dart. Eleanor Vance stammered, offering vague excuses about being too busy or the informal nature of their discussions. But her confidence had evaporated. The self-assured teacher was gone, replaced by a cornered woman, her eyes betraying a growing panic. The jury, once swayed by her tears, now saw through the performance, sensing the fear beneath the surface. Then, the true moment of collapse. Jenkins brought up a recovered email fragment from Ms. Vance to Ethan, one that the defense had argued was completely out of context and irrelevant. It was a single sentence. Just remember, our secret is safe, Ethan. No one else needs to understand. Ms. Vance, Jenkins stated, her voice resonating with quiet power, you claim there was no secret. You claim this was a transparent, professional relationship. Yet, here is your own writing, speaking of our secret and the need for no one else to understand. What exactly was the secret? Ms. Vance? What was it that no one else was supposed to understand? Eleanor Vance went utterly silent. The color drained from her face. Her eyes, once brimming with theatrical tears, were now wide with genuine terror. She tried to speak, but only a choked gasp emerged. Her lawyer, Marcus Thorne, quickly interjected with an objection, but the damage was irreversible. The words, "Our secret is safe," echoed in the silent courtroom, shattering every last shred of her carefully curated innocence. Judge Hayes watched, her expression unreadable, but a subtle tightening around her mouth suggested she had seen enough. The jury, previously torn, now appeared united in their grim understanding. The mask had finally fallen. The charismatic teacher, the compassionate mentor, had been exposed. The psychological manipulation, the carefully constructed dependency, the insidious secret bond, it all came crashing down with that one devastating phrase. The closing arguments were a stark contrast. Thorne, his earlier confidence replaced by a desperate plea, tried to reframe the narrative, to highlight the lack of direct physical evidence, to emphasize the he-said-she-said nature of the case. He argued for reasonable doubt, for the presumption of innocence, for the danger of condemning a good person based on a traumatized boy's confused memories. But his voice lacked its usual conviction, overshadowed by the echoes of Ms. Vance's own incriminating words. Ada Jenkins's closing was a powerful, quiet summation. She didn't need to shout. She simply walked the jury through the evidence again, linking Ethan's raw, often messy, testimony to Dr. Reed's clinical analysis, to Chloe's corroborating experience, to the overwhelming digital footprint, and finally, to Eleanor Vance's own words, betraying her guilt. She spoke not just of legal guilt, but of moral bankruptcy, of the profound abuse of power, of a predator who preyed on vulnerability hidden behind a smile. This case, ladies and gentlemen, Jenkins concluded, her voice barely a whisper, yet resonating throughout the silent courtroom, is not about a sudden, violent act. It is about a slow, systematic destruction of a young soul, a betrayal of the highest trust, hidden behind a facade of care and intellectual connection. Eleanor Vance didn't just break the law, she shattered a boy's innocence, piece by agonizing piece. And her own words, her own actions, have revealed the terrifying truth of her secret bond. The nightmare for Ethan began long before this courtroom. Today, it is time to end it. The jury retired, the weight of their decision pressing heavily on the entire building. Hours turned into a day. The media frenzy outside reached a fever pitch. Public outrage, once divided, had now solidified, clamoring for justice. Inside, the silence of the courtroom was punctuated only by the nervous shuffling of feet, the occasional cough, and the heavy breathing of those awaiting judgment. When the verdict finally came, the entire courtroom held its breath. The foreman stood, grim-faced, and read the words that would reverberate through the community, across headlines, and into the annals of true crime. We, the jury, find the defendant, Eleanor Vance, guilty. A collective gasp ripped through the public gallery, quickly followed by sobs of relief and quiet murmurs of shock. Eleanor Vance stood, her face utterly devoid of emotion, a blank mask of defeat. Marcus Thorne, for once, looked utterly deflated. And for Ethan Miller, watching from the gallery, it was the first fragile step towards reclaiming a future that had been stolen from him, a testament that even the most insidious secrets, meticulously hidden and expertly denied, can eventually be dragged into the harsh, unforgiving light of justice. The courtroom nightmare had ended, but the scars, for all involved, would last a lifetime.